Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Cherilyn. Today I'm going to show you how to knit this striped sweater. The structure is quite simple. I knitted the front and back panel separately, and then I joined them at the shoulder seam, and then I picked up stitches from the panels and made the sleeve. And as you can see, because we would be working in the round like this at the neckline, it's better if you have circular needles. So I have a set like this, and this is what it looks like on the inside. To have different sizes of needles here, you also have some cables, which means you could have 2 or 3 pair of circular needles. And the reason why I say it's good if you have this is mainly because of the cables. If you don't have exactly this, but you do have lots of long straight needles and scrap yarn, and you're confident you can be flexible with them, that's also fine. But I encourage you to go through the whole video to see if you have enough needles for it. But don't worry, I'll explain the needles once we get into the tutorial. Fun fact about this video, the first part of the video was actually filmed about 2 years ago, but I never got to finish the sweater, and I think I got distracted by some other projects, but I recently picked it up. I didn't want to leave it unfinished, so the second panel was almost finished 2 years ago, and everything after that was filmed recently, but it still took me very long to come up with the rest of the pattern and to edit the video seamlessly, making sure nothing that I know is left out. So I hope you enjoy this video, and please give it a like, leave a comment, it'll really help out the channel. So this is the yarn I'm going to be using for this project. This yarn is weight 5, bulky yarn. It calls for 6mm needles. And you can see the gauge here. With 6mm needles, 13 stitches is 10 centimeters. 18 rows is 10 centimeters as well. But I'm going to be using 7mm circular needles, so my gauge would be a bit different. For me, every 13 stitches would be more than 10 centimeters. Besides the yarn and needles, you will also need scissors, a yarn needle. You don't necessarily need a tape measure, but it's better if you do. So because I used a bigger needle, it only takes me 12 stitches to reach 4 inches, which is 10 centimeters. For the ribbing, if you have a smaller needle, use that. For me, I'm going to be using a 6mm, 1mm smaller. But if you don't have a smaller needle, it's okay. You can just use one needle size. The reason why we do that is because of the nature of the ribbing. If you use the same needle size, the stitches here will just be bigger than the main pattern stockinette stitch. As you can see, your stitch number in each row is going to be the width of the sweater. I wanted to make the panel about 65 centimeters wide. So according to my gauge, I need 78 stitches for that, but the stitch number needs to be a multiple of 4 because the ribbing pattern is 2x2 rib. So that means 4 stitch repeat. So I rounded my stitch number up to 80 stitches. We're going to first make a back panel. We're going to begin from the bottom of the panel, work the ribbing first, and then the main panel. So the cast on method is long tail cast on. The stitches we're going to be using is only knit and purl. So if you don't know how to do those things, I've linked them right here. These are complete beginner tutorials showing you how to long tail cast on, how to knit a stitch, and how to purl a stitch. So I'm going to begin with this color. Like I said before, the cast on method is long tail cast on, so leave about 2 meters here and then make a slip knot. I'm just making a cross like this and then pull this end through the loop like this. And then with the short tail facing me, insert my needle. So this is the tail side, and then I'm going to use long tail cast on. I'm going to do one in slow motion, but if you need step-by-step tutorial, check out the links. So now we have 2 loops here. I'm going to keep casting on like this until I have 80 loops on my needle. Last one. So now I've got 80 loops on my needle. And then I'm going to turn it. Make sure you're working with the yarn that's connected to the ball instead of the tail. So for the ribbing row, we're just going to knit 2 and purl 2. So I'm going to knit this first stitch. So that was a knit stitch. I'm going to knit the next stitch as well. After 2 knit stitch, I'm going to purl the next stitch. To purl a stitch, you need to make sure your yarn is at the front. So you're just going to bring the yarn to the front between the 2 needles, like so, and then you're ready to purl your next stitch. The next stitch, I'm going to purl it as well. Okay, and then we're just going to repeat those 4 stitches, knit 2 and purl 2. To knit a stitch, don't forget to bring your yarn to the back and then knit the next 2 stitches. Knit 1, knit 2, and then purl the next 2 stitches. So bring your yarn to the front and then purl the next stitch, purl the next as well, and then repeat again. This first row is going to be a bit tight to work in because of the cast on stitches, but it's going to get better. So you're just going to repeat this for the entire row. So whenever you finish a row, you just turn your work like this. So switch your needles and begin your next row. So this is the first row of the ribbing. We're just going to repeat this row 9 more times so that we have 10 rows in total for the ribbing. And to repeat this row, you just knit 2 and purl 2 again. So start by knitting your first stitch, Then knit the next stitch. Bring yarn to the front. Purl the next. And the next as well. Bring yarn to the back. And repeat the pattern. So I'm going to keep working like this and do 9 more rows like this. This is the end of row 10. So beginning from this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And the row on your needle does not count. And after 10 rows, we're going to begin the main pattern. For this panel, I did not purposely change color here. But just to make the two panels match, I need to change color here. And to change color, you just cut this yarn and get your new color. From the next row, we need to change our needle size as well. So for me, I need to change from 6 to 7 millimeter. But if you didn't use a smaller needle for the ribbing, just ignore this changing needle part. So to do that, I just need to use my 7 millimeter to knit the next row. But with this set, I just need to switch them. So I use this to finish my first row, and then I switch this to 7 millimeter as well and use that to do my next row. So to change color, I'm going to hold this new color with my old color at the back like this. And then I'm gonna go ahead and knit my first stitch with the new color. The first few stitches is gonna be a bit loose. Go ahead and knit your next 2 stitches. And then turn my work. I'm going to tie these 2 ends together. And then that's it. We've changed color. So for this first row of the main panel, I'm just going to knit every stitch. Very easy, just knit every single stitch of this row. I'll meet you back at the end of the row. End of row 1. Finish my last stitch and turn. And then the next row, I need to switch needles again. If you don't have needles like mine, you just make sure your right hand needle is the same as this one. So for the second row, we're going to purl every stitch. To purl a stitch, make sure the yarn is at the front. And purl the first stitch. And the next one as well. So this is row 2. And after you finish this row, you're just going to repeat these 2 rows, which is knit 1 row and purl 1 row. If you don't remember if your next row should be knit or purl, you can just look at your stitches. When this side is facing you, you need to knit your next row. When the other side is facing you, you need to purl that row. So I'm just going to keep repeating these 2 rows and work my way up. And I'm going to try to match the color patterns as well. So for example, for this color, I have 18 rows from here to here. So to make sure I have 18 rows for this color as well, I'm going to make sure I have 17 beads like this. And this row is going to be number 18. So like this. If you want to do a certain number of rows in the color, include this row on your needle as well. So if I want to have 18 rows of this color, I would include this row as well. So starting from here, this is the first row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So once I have this, I would change color from the next row. Doesn't matter if it's knit or purl, I would change from the next row. So even though the measurements of the panel is more important than your row count or your stitch number, you still need to count it, you still need to know it, because your front panel needs to match. So I finished the back panel, and this is how long it is. The height is about 22 inches, which is 56 centimeters. So I've got 18 rows of color 1, 19 rows of color 2, 19 for color 3, 18 for color 4, and 18 again for color 5, and that's including the one on the cable. So in total, that's 92 rows. So for the back panel, I stopped there. After that, I left the stitches on the cable and replaced the needles with stitch stoppers to secure the stitches. You can also use a scrap yarn to replace the cable and then tie the ends together like this. I then started the front panel in the same way, but the last 10 rows were different from the back panels because I needed to reshape the neckline. So before I decided from which row I should start shaping the neckline, I put the panel against my shoulder to see how wide I need the neckline to be. I decided on 30 stitches for that. Also, the stitch number I leave out at the center needs to be an even number so that I can have the same number of stitches for each shoulder. Because the panel has 80 stitches, 30 stitches at the center to be left out. That gives me 25 stitches for each shoulder. Now, this is the last 5 rows though. The 5 rows before that, I needed to do decrease to make this kind of shape. So the row below it, I wanted to have one more stitch for each shoulder. So each shoulder has 26 stitches, and that's 28 stitches left out at the center. Following this pattern, the row below it, 27 stitches for each shoulder and 26 stitches at the center. So as you can see, I have the decrease pattern written down for 5 rows here. These are the shoulders and these are the stitches I need to work. When the front panel has 82 rows, which is 10 rows shorter than the back panel, I started to split the shoulders. The first row, I have 30 stitches for each shoulder, so I counted 30 stitches from each side and placed a stitch marker on the cable to separate them from the center 20 stitches. I first knitted these shoulder stitches to the very first stitch marker. So for this shoulder, I need to work back and forth like this. Decrease 1 stitch each row on the next side. Now, I need to turn and work my way back, but I need to decrease on this side. And to do that, I simply just didn't work the first stitch, but to prevent it from being undone, I slipped it onto my left needle. So I'm basically just borrowing that needle to hold that stitch in position. Then I turned, and to separate the shoulder stitches from the stitch I just slipped onto the right needle, I placed another stitch marker here. Then I purled the next row. This row has 29 stitches. The next row is a knit row. It should have 28 stitches, so I knitted the first 28 stitches. And the last stitch, I need to leave it out, leave it on the left needle. I used that stitch marker to separate the new shoulder row, so I had to take it out first like that. and then put the stitch back on, and then the stitch marker. So this row is done. The next row, I need to leave out the first stitch again to decrease. So stitch marker out again. Slip that stitch on the left needle and not knit it. Use the stitch marker to separate them. And purl the next row all the way to the end. The next knit row, I should have 26 stitches for it. So again, the last stitch is not worked, and I put it to the left side of the stitch marker. The next row has 25 stitches for each shoulder, so I decrease one more row. So again, the first stitch, I didn't work it. I just slipped it onto the left needle. Then I purled the rest of the stitches. This row, I should have 25 stitches. So after I finished that row, my panel looked like this. Between the two stitch markers, I have 5 stitches. And after the stitch marker, 25 stitches. From here, I just kept working these loops back and forth without any decrease. Worked 4 more rows to make my front panel the same row count as the back one. And the 4 rows are knit, purl, and because I don't need to decrease anymore, every time I do a knit row, I worked all the way to the stitch marker and back. After that, the shoulder is completely done. Instead of casting off here, I left the stitches like this because I wanted to join them with the back panel all together when I was done with the other shoulder. This way I don't need to cast off twice, I just need to do it once when I join the two panels together. I cut my yarn here and started working on the other shoulder. On this shoulder, I started with a purl row. I worked the first 30 stitches to the stitch marker, turned. The next row I decreased, so I didn't work the first stitch, but slipped it onto the right needle. Placed the marker to separate the shoulder stitches. Then I knitted the rest 29 stitches. On the next purl row, in order to decrease, I didn't work into the last stitch. For this row, I have 28 stitches. The next knit row left out the first stitch. This row has 27 stitches. And the next purl row has 26 stitches after decreasing. And the row after that is the first row that has 25 stitches for the shoulder. I slipped the first stitch and knitted every stitch to the end of the row. And after that, I continued working back and forth for another 4 rows without decrease. So that's the front panel and that's the back panel. Now I need to join the shoulders. For the back panel, I need to mark out the center 30 stitches. So I have 25 stitches on each side to be joined with the shoulders. By the way, I also did this from the wrong side so that the finished seam wouldn't show when the sweater is done. So this method is actually something I've learned before, but have never actually incorporated into my own project. But I love the look of it, and I was really excited to try it on this sweater. So it's pretty much just knitting the stitches from both panels together. With this method, the seam can be stretchier, and I also didn't need to cast off twice. The only thing is I needed scrap yarn or cables to hold the stitches, and I also needed needles on the end to knit. The size of the needle doesn't matter, it just makes it easier to knit from them. Also, the working needle doesn't have to be circular needle, it can be a short, straight needle, because at most, there will only be 2 stitches on this needle at the same time. And if you don't have circle needles, you're using scrap yarn to hold the stitches for the 2 panels, you can still do this. You just place the first few stitches of each panel on a straight needle. So you have 2 straight needles, 1 for each panel. You knit them at the same time, and then transfer the next few stitches from the scrap yarn or the cables onto the straight needles and knit them again. And then just repeat that. It's going to take a little more time, but it's definitely doable. So with this method, I'm still casting off kind of as normal, but I'm just doing the stitches on both needles at the same time. So both panels have a tail. I just used the one that's connected to the yarn ball. So I insert in the first stitch of both panels. So both of the first stitches. Grab the yarn, create a loop, and then knit both stitches together. You can do this one by one first. And then I went ahead and knitted the next stitch of both panels. And once I have 2 stitches on the right needle, I pulled the first stitch over the second one, just like how you would when you cast off normally. Then I knitted 1 more stitch, pulled the loop before over this loop again. So I just continued doing this to the first stitch markers. That's one shoulder done. So I fastened off, cut the yarn, and pulled it through the loop. And that is the seam. It looks pretty good. I then used the same method and joined the other shoulder. when both shoulders are done, what you have here is a neckline. I turned this inside out to work the neckline. So what I did next was picking up stitches around the neckline. For the front panel, I also needed to pick up stitches from these 5 rows. So the neckline, right? I cut the yarn from the shoulder. And starting from the center of the back panel, I picked up stitches. I have 2 center stitches. I started from the left one and inserted my needle in that loop. To attach the yarn, I first made a slip knot. And then pulled that slip knot through that loop. And then from the next stitch, I picked up a loop from each loop. And when I picked it up, I made sure to insert knitwise, which is like that. I also made sure to go above the cable, yarn over and pull up a loop. The loops were a bit hard to pick up because they've been staying on this thin cable. So I kind of need to insert purlwise to pick that loop up first, and then insert knitwise above the cable and pull up a loop. But I later realized I can use another needle, just pick that stitch up, put it on my needle, and then insert knitwise, and then basically just knit that stitch. So I first picked up these loops to the shoulder seam, and to make it easier, I got rid of the cable here. If you're using scrap yarn, you simply just pull it out. Stop here, and you can tie this together to secure it if you're using scrap yarn. So I got to the shoulder seam. In the seam, I picked up one more loop. And I have 5 rows here if you remember from the front panel. In these 5 stitches, I picked up 3 stitches. If you have a look here, that's the column on the very edge. That's the second column. You see loops here. That's the third column. Insert between the first and the second column. And I have 5 rows here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 loops. Skip the first loop. Insert in the second loop here. Make sure you insert between the first and the second column. So that's one. And then pick up a stitch in the next row, which is a space next to it. And then do it a third time. And then I got you the stitches of the front panel. For these stitches, I just simply knitted every one of them. The stitch marker, I can take it off now. And then for these 5 rows on this side, I also picked up the center 3 stitches. And for this side, I also inserted between the first column and the second one. And then I need to pick up one more stitch at the shoulder seam before I do the stitches of the back panel. Now, I only have one circular needle left on my stitches. So now I have 68 stitches, which can be divided by 4, and that means I can do the same pattern as the bottom ribbing, which is knit 2 and purl 2. Then I started knitting this round. I placed the stitch marker at the beginning, so I'll know when to stop. To make sure the ribbing pattern stay consistent, I did 2 by 2 rib, which means I knit 2 stitches and then purl 2 stitches, and then knit 2 stitches, purl 2 stitches again. So I continued doing that all the way around. And then when you get to the stitch marker, you can start the next round. To start the next round, simply slip the stitch marker over and then work the next round, alternating between 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. So that's 2 rows I did. I want this neck ribbing to be longer, so I continued working. I worked 8 rounds because I was running out of yarn, but you can do pretty much as many rounds as you like, depending on how thick you want the neck ribbing to be. And then I cast off. To cast this off, I'm gonna knit the knit stitches and purl the purl stitches. So I'll still slip the stitch marker. I'm gonna knit the first 2 stitches. Then I'm gonna ignore these stitches on my needle. Just look at these 2. When I have 2 stitches here, I'm gonna pull the first one over the second one. This is kind of like that part when we joined the shoulders. And then that was 2 knit stitches. The next stitch is purl. To purl a stitch, we need to bring yarn to the front and then purl that stitch. And then I need to bring that first loop over this one with the yarn at the back. And then pull this over the second loop. Next stitch is purl again. I need to bring yarn back to the front, purl the next stitch, and then do the same thing, bring yarn to the back, and pull that over the new loop. And then that's pretty much it. Knit the knits, purl the purls, and then when you have 2 loops here, bring the first one over the second one, but with this yarn at the back. So the next stitch knits, pull it over, next stitch knit, pull it over, next stitch purl, bring yarn at the back, pull it over, next stitch purl, bring yarn to the front, and then bring yarn to the back and pull it over like that. So I'll continue doing that all the way around to the end of the round. When you finish the last stitch, cut the yarn and pull it through. Use a yarn needle to join the last stitch to the first. So you just locate the first column and then go in to the top 2 loops like that. And then I'll go back through these top 2 loops. And then go back through these top 2 loops again. Then I'll go through these top 2 loops in and out like that, just to secure it more. And then after that, I can fasten off on the wrong side. So I'll just go through this knit column. Make sure the right side still looks good. And I'll fasten off here. So you just create 2 loops by going through this 1 loop twice. And then go through these 2 loops. It's just something I came up with. You don't have to do exactly that. To make the sleeve, I placed my panels like this. This is the shoulder seam. I need to count 36 rows here for this panel to pick up my stitches, and then 36 rows here as well, so together 72 rows. And I happen to have 18 rows for this color and 18 rows for this, so it's very obvious where I need to start. So I need to insert my hook between the first column and the second one here to pick up stitches. I started from the 36th row here. Insert between the first and the second column. Made a slip knot. Pull it through. And then directly move up to the next space. Bring yarn around and then pull it through. For every 3 rows, I'll pick up 2 stitches, so that's 2 stitches. For the 3rd row, I'm not going to pick up anything, so skip that space and then start from the next one. So that's 1, 2, and then skip. So 3 rows again, only picked up 2 stitches, and then you just continue doing this. That's the last 2 stitches of the 3 rows. For the last row, I didn't pick up anything, so now on this needle, I should have 48 stitches. I had 72 rows. For every 3 rows, I picked up 2 stitches, so I have 48 stitches. So that's like the first row, that's a knit row. For the arm, I didn't work in the round, I worked flat. So I just turned my work and purled the next row. When I finished this row, I just turned and then knit the next row. So I was just alternating between a knit row and a purl row. And I worked to this color. So that's 28 rows of loops that I have. About 6.5 inches. and that is 16.5 centimeters. Then I did one row of decrease here, and that decrease row is done on a knit row, and it's done like this. This is me decreasing too early on the 4th row, but this decrease row is done in the same way, so you just focus on this row itself. It's very simple. The first 2 stitches, I just knit them together, and then you knit every single stitch one by one. Then the last 2 stitches, you knit them together again. And that's it. So after you finish that decrease row, go ahead and purl your next row as usual. Just purl every stitch. So if that decrease row is row 1, I did row 2 purl and then knit purl. That's row 3 and 4. And then 4 more rows. That's a total of 8 rows, including that first decrease row. So again, that is 1 row of decrease, 2 purl, 3 knit, 4 purl, 5 knit, 6 purl, 7 knit, 8 purl. And then after those 8 rows, the next row is a knit row again. And then from that row, you do these 8 rows again, do a decrease row, and then 7 rows normal. So that's 16 rows. I did it in this color. And then after that, I have another 16 rows of this color. But for this color, I decreased a bit faster than this. So instead of decreasing every 8 rows, I decreased every 4 rows. So the first row is knit, decrease, and then purl, knit, purl, 3 rows normal. And then those 4 rows, repeat them 3 more times, and that makes 16 rows. And then for this color, I did decrease, and then purl, knit, purl, normal, and then decrease again, and then 1 more purl row normal, and that's 6 rows. And then I started doing the cuff, as you can see, and the cuff pattern is the same as the bottom ribbing, and that's just knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, all the way to the end of the row. And when you start the next row, it's the same pattern. Start with knit 2, purl 2, and then knit 2, purl 2, and then back and forth like that. So that's 10 rounds. I have 16 row of loops in this color because I have 6 rows normal and 10 rows for the cuff. Then I cast off, and the cast off of this is the same as the neck ribbing. So you knit the knit stitches, purl the purl stitches, and every time you have 2 loops on your right needle, pull the first one over the second loop with the yarn at the back. So when you finish this, you kind of wanna leave a long tail before you cut the yarn because you wanna use that yarn to sew up the sleeve and the side seam. So leave about 2 meters and cut the yarn. Now to sew this up, first I'll join this corner together. So I'll just go in the top 2 loops here. And then I go back to the top 2 loops on this side. And then I'll go through the top 2 loops on this side one more time, just to secure it. Okay, then I'm gonna start sewing up the edges. So every time I insert my needle, it's gonna be between the first column and the second one on this side, the first column and the second one on this side as well. And for this side, I have 2 purl columns. That's 2 knit, 2 purl. Between them is this. So I'm going to start from row 1, go in, come out from row 2, which is the space just above it. And then on this side, I have 2 knit columns. The space between them is this. I also need to make sure I go in from row 1. Here. And come out from row 2. The next part is kind of fun. So basically you would just go back in to the space you just come out of. For me, it's this one. And then come out from the space just above it. Don't pull too tight for now. And then do the same thing on this side. Go back into the same space you come out of, and then come out from the space above it. And then you repeat this. And then after some stitches, you can pull this yarn. This part is very satisfying for me. So make sure you don't pull too tight. Hold on to this very edge when you pull. And it looks like that. And because we have decrease from this direction, it'll be increase. We will not be following straight up like that, but you just make sure you insert into this very edge here. Like for this one, that's the edge, 2 loops. So instead of moving up, I'll move to the space that's 2 ways left. Like that. And do it on this side as well. So I'll just continue sewing up this seam. When you finish under the sleeve, you can just directly do the side seam. For the side seam, also go in the very edge between the first and the second column. And the cuff is the same. You just follow that column and go straight down. At the very bottom, I went into the bottom 2 loops of each corner. So basically, you just try to hide this color on the wrong side of the seam, and then fasten off by going through the seam. I happen to have yarn tails here, so I just tied them together. And cut. This one, I'll do the same thing. I'll go through the seam and then tie it up with one of these and then cut all these. When you finish all that, your sweater is pretty much done. All you need to do is fasten off the yarn tails on the wrong side.